They called him the Iron Prince, a man forged in the crucible of war, his heart rumoured to be as cold as the winter mountains of his kingdom. Princess Aurelia of Eldoria was the price of peace, a lamb sent to the wolf's den. She expected a life of fear, of silent obedience to a cruel husband. What she found was a web of secrets, a court of vipers, and a man whose eyes held not cruelty, but a torment she couldn't comprehend. Her marriage was a political cage, but the key to unlocking it, and his heart was hidden in a forgotten memory from their childhood. Princess Aurelia of Eldoria felt the finality of her old life in the rhythmic jolting of the carriage. For weeks, the gilded cage on wheels had carried her away from the sun-drenched hills and warm seas of her homeland toward the jagged, frost-bitten peaks of Cinderfall. Each league north stole more colour from the landscape, mirroring the slow draining of hope from her heart. She was a political pawn, a treaty sealed in flesh and blood, destined for the bed of Prince Valerius. The stories about him were the stuff of nightmares, whispered by servants and envoys alike. They called him the Iron Prince, a name earned not through noble inheritance, but carved into the annals of history with the blood of his enemies. He had taken command of Cinderfall's fractured armies at 17 and hammered them into a merciless unified force. He had crushed the Northern Rebellion with a strategy so brutal it was still spoken of with a shudder. They said he felt nothing, not pity, not remorse, not love. He was the unforgiving winter of his own land personified. Aurelia smoothed the deep crimson velvet of her travelling gown, a colour chosen to honour the sigil of Cinderfall, a black wolf on a field of red. It felt like a shroud. Her lady-in-waiting, a nervous young woman named Lena, sat opposite, wringing her hands. They say the capital is built entirely of black granite. Your Highness, Lena whispered, her voice trembling, and that the sun is seldom seen through the mountain mists. Aurelia offered a smile she did not feel. Then we shall have to be the sun, Lena. But the bravado felt hollow, a child's wish against a gathering storm. She clutched a small leather-bound book of Eldorian poetry, the last tangible piece of her home. Her father, a kind but pragmatic king, had told her this marriage would save them from a devastating war. Your sacrifice will be remembered as the bedrock of a lasting peace. He had said, his eyes filled with a sorrow that offered little comfort. A sacrifice. That is what she was. The carriage rumbled through towering iron gates, the screech of the metal, a lament for her lost freedom. The capital Vorlag was exactly as described. Stark, imposing structures of dark stone clawed at the grey sky, their sharp angles and severe lines a testament to a kingdom that valued strength over beauty. There were no bright banners, no cheering crowds. The people who lined the streets watched her procession with sullen, wary eyes. They were not welcoming a princess. They were inspecting a foreign tribute. She was escorted directly to the great hall of the citadel. It was a cavernous space, its stone walls absorbing the light from the high, narrow windows, leaving everything in a state of perpetual twilight. At the far end, on a throne carved from a single block of obsidian, sat her future. Prince Valerius was even more formidable than the tales had suggested. He was tall and broad-shouldered, clad in black leather and steel that seemed an extension of his own being. His hair was the colour of raven feathers, and his face was all sharp lines and severe angles, as if carved from the very granite of his city. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a startling pale grey, the colour of a winter sky before a blizzard, and they watched her approach with an unnerving, unreadable intensity. There was no warmth in them, no welcome, only assessment. He did not rise as she approached, He simply watched his hand resting on the hilt of the sword at his side. The court, a collection of grim-faced men and women dressed in somber hues, remained utterly silent. The air was thick with tension. Aurelia stopped before the dais and performed the deep curtsy her station required, her heart hammering against her ribs. She kept her eyes lowered as she had been instructed. To show defiance now would be a fool's errand. Princess Aurelia of Eldoria, a herald, announced his voice, booming unnaturally in the silence. Presented to His Royal Highness, Prince Valerius of Cinderfall, to fulfill the Treaty of the Twin Thrones. A long, agonizing moment passed. She could feel his gaze on her, heavy as a physical weight. "Rise," he commanded. His voice was deep and resonant, yet devoid of any emotion. It was the sound of grinding stone. She rose slowly, forcing herself to meet his gaze. She had expected to see cruelty, perhaps a flicker of sadistic pleasure. Instead, she saw nothing. A complete, chilling emptiness. It was more terrifying than any open hostility. The ceremony was brief and cold. A priest of the northern gods spoke ancient words about duty, lineage, and strength. There were no mentions of love or partnership. It was a transaction, a binding of kingdoms. When it came time for the vows, Valerius's hand was cool and firm as it closed over hers. His touch sent a shiver through her, not of passion, but of primal fear. He recited his promises in that same flat, powerful tone, his grey eyes locked on hers. When it was her turn, her voice was a faint whisper, but it did not break. She spoke the words of loyalty and obedience, each one a nail in the coffin of her former life. As the priest declared them wed, a perfunctory cheer went up from the court, but it died as quickly as it began. There was no feast, no celebration. Her husband, the thought was a shock, turned to her. "You will be shown to your chambers," he said, the words clipped and final. It was a dismissal. He then turned to a grim-looking man with a scarred face who stood near the throne. "Garrick, see to it that the princess is accommodated. Inform her of the household rules." With that, he strode from the great hall without a backward glance, his black cape billowing behind him like the wings of a predator. The court began to disperse, casting curious, pitying glances her way. Aurelia stood alone on the dais, her new husband gone, her old life a distant memory. The weight of the iron crown of Cinderfall felt impossibly heavy on her head. Lena rushed to her side, her face pale. "Your Highness," she began. But Aurelia held up a hand, her composure a fragile shield. The Iron Prince had not been a myth. She was married to him. She was trapped in his cold, dark kingdom, and the only thing she knew for certain was that she was utterly and completely alone. The sacrifice had been made. Now survival had to begin. The princess's chambers were as grand and as cold as the rest of the citadel. They were a suite of rooms, spacious and furnished with heavy dark wood furniture, intricately carved with wolves and ravens. Rich tapestries depicting brutal historical battles covered the stone walls, their threads doing little to ward off the permeating chill. The bed was a monstrous four-poster, hung with velvet curtains the color of dried blood. It was a luxurious prison, a gilded cage. On the first morning of her new life, Garrick, the prince's captain of the guard, appeared at her door. He was a mountain of a man, his face a roadmap of old scars, but his eyes, unlike his master's, held a flicker of something that might have been weary sympathy. He presented her with a scrolled parchment tied with a black ribbon. "The prince's rules for his household, Your Highness." He stated, his voice a low rumble. "He expects them to be followed, without exception." Aurelia took the scroll, Her fingers trembled slightly as she unrolled it. The rules were stark and impersonal, written in a severe, precise script. You will not leave your designated wing without an escort of 2 guards. You will not speak to any member of the court unless spoken to first. You will take your meals in your chambers, alone. You will be present for official state functions when summoned. You will stand beside me. You will not speak. Your correspondence with Eldoria will be subject to review before it is sent. The list went on. It was a meticulously crafted blueprint for her isolation. He was not just her husband. He was her jailer. He intended to keep her as a beautiful, silent symbol of their treaty, locked away and forgotten. The last rule was the cruelest cut of all. He was severing her from her home, from the last vestiges of her identity. Days bled into a monotonous week. Aurelia saw her husband only once, after the wedding, a brief, silent encounter in a hallway, where he passed her without a word, his grey eyes sweeping over her, as if she were a piece of furniture. The court followed his lead. The ladies were polite but distant, their conversations ceasing the moment she entered a room. The lords offered curt bows but never met her eye. They feared him, and by extension, they kept their distance from her. She was the prince's property, and no one dared to trespass. Lena was her only comfort, but even she grew more timid and withdrawn, with each passing day scared of the whispering shadows and the grim-faced guards who were their constant companions. Aurelia tried to combat the crushing solitude. She read every book in her chamber's small library, she practiced her needlepoint until her fingers were sore, and she spent hours staring out the tall arched window that overlooked the citadel's central courtyard. It was a bleak, paved space where soldiers trained from dawn until dusk, their shouts and the clash of steel a constant, violent symphony. It was from this window, one dreary afternoon, that she saw the first crack in the Iron Prince's armor. Valerius was in the yard sparring with Garrick. He moved with a lethal grace that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. His sword was a blur of silver, his focus absolute. He disarmed his captain with a flick of his wrist, the man's sword clattering on the flagstones. For a moment he stood over his defeated opponent, the very image of the ruthless warrior from the stories. Then something happened. A young stable boy, no older than 10, tripped while carrying a heavy bucket of water, sprawling onto the stones near the prince's feet. The boy froze his face, a mask of pure terror, expecting a blow or a harsh reprimand. The guards around the yard tensed. Valerius did not rage. He simply lowered his sword, his expression unreadable. He walked to the boy and crouched down his large frame, making the child look even smaller. Aurelia held her breath, her knuckles white where she gripped the stone windowsill. The prince spoke to the boy, his voice too low for her to hear. He then reached out not to strike, but to help the boy to his feet. He righted the bucket, and with a nod sent the child scrambling away unharmed. Valerius then turned his gaze upward, directly toward her window. It was as if he had known she was watching. Their eyes met across the courtyard for a long, charged moment. His expression was not cold or empty, but something else entirely, a flash of fierce, guarded emotion she couldn't name. It was there, and then gone, replaced by the familiar, impassive mask as he turned and walked away. The incident was small, insignificant to anyone else. But for Aurelia, it was a fissure in the granite facade of her husband. Cruel men did not show quiet kindness to frightened children when they thought no one was watching. Or did they? Perhaps it was a calculated actor performance for some unseen audience, yet she could not shake the image from her mind. A few days later, a second event occurred. Aurelia was walking in the small walled garden, that she was permitted to use her 2 guards trailing at a respectful distance. She found a hawk with a broken wing, huddled beneath a thorny rosebush, its dark eyes wide with pain and fear. It was one of the royal hunting birds, a beautiful and valuable creature. As she debated what to do, a shadow fell over her. She turned to find Valerius standing there. He must have come from a private entrance. "It is injured," she said, her voice sounding small. He did not reply. He knelt, shrugging off his heavy gloves. He spoke to the bird in a low, soothing tone, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. With breathtaking gentleness, he gathered the hawk into his hands, his long, deft fingers examining the damaged wing with an expert's touch. The bird, which should have panicked and fought, seemed to quiet under his hands. "The bone is set poorly. It will not fly again if it heals this way," he murmured more to himself than to her. He then looked at her, his grey eyes piercing. "Were you going to help it?" "I didn't know how," she confessed. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He held the hawk securely against his chest and stood. "Come with me." It was not a request. He led her not back toward the main citadel, but to a small, isolated tower she had not seen before. Inside was a mews, clean and well-kept, filled with perches and nesting boxes. He placed the injured hawk on a padded table and began to work, fetching splints linen and some kind of salve. He moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency, his complete focus on the bird. He reset the bone with a swift, sure movement there, ignoring the hawk's pained cry. He then carefully splinted and bound the wing, his touch now impossibly gentle. He had not ordered a servant or a falconer. He was doing it himself. Aurelia watched in silence, utterly fascinated. This was not the Iron Prince, the ruthless commander. This was a healer, a caretaker. When he was finished, he moved the hawk to a soft bed of straw in a quiet nesting box. He washed his hands in a basin of water, the silence stretching between them. "Why do you do that yourself?" she finally asked her curiosity, overpowering her fear. He turned to face her, drying his hands on a cloth. His expression was once again shuttered, the moment of softness gone. "Because I am responsible for those who serve this kingdom, even the animals." His voice was clipped formal. "The wing will heal. It will fly again." He was about to leave when he paused at the door. He looked back at her, his gaze lingering for a moment. "Do not mistake a necessary action for a weakness, princess." And then he was gone, leaving her alone with the quiet sounds of the mews and a maelstrom of confusion. He had let her see something a part of him that contradicted everything she had been told. He had shown her kindness both to a child and an animal, and then he had warned her against believing it. It was a paradox, a puzzle she couldn't begin to solve. She was in a cage, yes, but she was beginning to suspect her jailer was far more complex and perhaps far more tormented than the entire world believed. The contradictions of Prince Valerius gnawed at Aurelia. Her life remained one of suffocating routine and isolation, yet the memory of his gentle hands on the broken hawk and his unexpected kindness to the stable boy replayed in her mind. He was a man of 2 faces, the unyielding Iron Prince he showed the world, and the quiet, hidden man who surfaced in unguarded moments. She began to watch him more closely during the rare state functions she was commanded to attend. Standing silently by his side as he held court, she saw the deference and fear he commanded. Nobles and petitioners approached the throne with their heads bowed, their voices carefully measured. One man in particular, a high-ranking lord named Corbin, seemed to be a constant presence. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with clever eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. He was always flattering the prince, always agreeing with his harsh judgments. Yet Aurelia felt a deep sense of unease whenever he was near. There was an ambition in Lord Corbyn's eyes that he could not quite conceal. Valerius treated Corbyn with the same cold formality he showed everyone, but Aurelia noticed the slight narrowing of her husband's eyes whenever the man spoke, a subtle tension in his jaw. The prince was listening to more than just Corbyn's words. One evening, a banquet was held in honor of a visiting trade delegation. Aurelia was seated at the high table to Valerius's right, a silent, decorative consort. The hall was filled with the sounds of feasting and forced merriment. Throughout the meal, Valerius was a forbidding presence, speaking little, his gaze constantly sweeping the room, missing nothing. Halfway through the dinner, he leaned toward her, his proximity sending an unwelcome jolt through her. His voice was a low murmur, meant for her ears alone. "Do not drink the wine from your goblet." She froze her hand halfway to the ornate silver cup. She looked at him, her eyes wide with question, but his face was an unreadable mask as he turned back to a conversation with a portly merchant lord. Her heart began to pound. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an urgent command disguised as a quiet word. Her mind raced. Was it a test of her obedience or a genuine warning? Looking down at the deep red liquid, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draughty hall. She thought of Lord Corbyn, who had been speaking with the steward who had poured the wine just moments before. Slowly she lowered her hand. For the rest of the night, she feigned sips from the goblet, her throat dry with fear. Later, as she was being escorted back to her chambers, Valerius fell into step beside her, dismissing her guards with a flick of his hand. It was the first time they had ever walked together. The corridor was empty, their footsteps echoing off the cold stone. "You obeyed," he stated, his voice neutral. "You gave me a command, my prince," she replied, her own voice carefully toneless. He stopped, turning to face her in the torchlight. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows across his severe features. "Why do you think I gave it?" She met his gaze directly. "I believe you had a reason." A flicker of something surprised respect passed through his grey eyes before it was extinguished. "In this court, princess, everything has a reason. Trust nothing that is freely offered, and no one who smiles too easily." It was a lesson and another warning. He was teaching her how to survive in his world of shadows. Before she could ask more, he gave a curt nod. "Go to your chambers. Lena will bring you fresh water." He turned and walked away, leaving her with more questions than answers. The poisoned wine, if it had been poisoned, was a clear sign that danger was not just an external threat to Cinderfall, but a serpent coiled within the court itself. And Valerius knew it. This realization shifted her perspective. His rules, his isolation of her, were they meant to punish her or to protect her? The line between the two began to blur. Her new awareness made her more observant. She started listening, not just to conversations, but to the silences that fell when she approached. She watched the subtle exchanges of glances between courtiers. The citadel was not just a fortress of stone, but of secrets. A few nights after the banquet, unable to sleep, she wandered from her bedchamber into the adjoining sitting room. The moon was high, casting a silver light through the window. As she stood there, she heard the faint murmur of voices from the corridor outside. It was late. The halls should have been empty. Drawn by a mix of fear and curiosity, she crept to the heavy oak door and pressed her ear against the wood. The voices were low and urgent. "Cannot wait much longer," one voice said. She recognized it instantly. "Lord Corbyn. The prince is too cautious. He consolidates his power daily. Our window of opportunity is closing." "Patience, my lord," a second unfamiliar voice counseled. The last attempt with the wine was clumsy. It made him more watchful. "We need a moment when his guard is down." an accident, something that cannot be traced back to us, and the Eldorian bride Corbin asked. What of her? She is an irrelevance, a cloistered pet. If she dies with him, it will only add to the tragedy. It might even be blamed on her foreign influence, a failed Eldorian plot. A convenient narrative. Aurelia felt the blood drain from her face. They were talking about murdering her and Valerius. This was not just courtly intrigue, it was treason, a plot to seize the throne. Her heart hammered in her chest, a frantic bird trapped against her ribs. She backed away from the door silently, her mind reeling. They saw her as an irrelevance, a pet. They had no idea she had heard every word. She retreated to the far side of the room, her body trembling. Her first instinct was to run to the guards, to scream treason. But then her husband's words echoed in her mind. Trust no one. How did she know which guards were loyal? Corbin was a powerful man. His influence could run deep. Rushing out with a wild accusation from the foreign princess, whom no one trusted, would be dismissed, or worse, it would expose her and hasten their plans. No. She had to tell Valerius, only him. But how her? Every move was monitored. A sudden request for an audience would be noted, perhaps even reported to Corbin. She needed a way to reach him without raising suspicion. Her gaze fell upon the small walled garden she was allowed to frequent. He had found her there once before. It was secluded, often empty. Perhaps if she could lure him there. A plan began to form, fragile and dangerous. She had been brought to Cinderfall as a pawn, a silent symbol of peace. But the whispers in the stone had changed the game. They thought she was a cloistered pet. They were about to learn that even in a cage, a creature can learn to fight. She would not be an irrelevant casualty in their treacherous schemes. She would be the one to warn the Iron Prince. Aurelia's days took on a new, sharp-edged purpose. The fear was a constant cold knot in her stomach, but it was overlaid with a resolute determination. She spent every permitted moment in the walled garden, hoping Valerius might appear again. She paced the stone paths, Lena watching her with worried eyes, no doubt mistaking her agitation for homesickness. But he did not come. The plot she had overheard festered in her mind, a poison she could not purge. She needed to understand her husband better. Not the Iron Prince, but the man who healed hawks and spoke to frightened children. If she was to trust him with this dangerous knowledge, she needed to believe there was something more beneath the steel. Driven by this need, she began a quiet, risky exploration of her wing of the castle. It was an old section, filled with rooms that were not in regular use. Her guards were posted at the main entrance to the wing, and as long as she stayed within its confines, she was left to her own devices. One afternoon, she discovered a heavy locked door at the end of a dusty corridor. It was different from the others, banded with iron and bearing an old, tarnished silver wolf's head knocker. Lena, who knew some of the citadel's history from the other servants, told her it led to the prince's old childhood chambers. They had been sealed after his mother's death, and his father, the late king, had forbidden anyone to enter. Valerius had never moved back in upon his return from the wars. Intrigued, Aurelia examined the lock. It was old and stiff. She remembered a set of antique keys she had found in a writing desk in her sitting room, dismissed as useless. On a hunch, she retrieved them. After several tense minutes of trying each one, a small ornate iron key scraped turned and the lock clicked open. With a deep breath, she pushed the heavy door inward. A wave of stale, cold air washed over her. The rooms within were cloaked in dust and shadow, preserved in time like a tomb. This was where the Iron Prince had grown up. The furniture was smaller, simpler than in the rest of the citadel. There was a small desk, a narrow bed, and shelves filled with books on military strategy and history. It was a stark, lonely space for a child. She ran a finger along a dusty bookshelf, imagining a young, serious boy poring over these texts, already being forged into the weapon his kingdom would need. There were no toys, no trinkets, only the tools of a future ruler and warrior. It was heartbreakingly Spartan. Her eyes were drawn to a small, carved wooden box tucked away on the lowest shelf, half hidden behind a thick tome on siege tactics. It was a simple thing clearly made by a child's unskilled hand. It seemed out of place in the severe room. Compelled by a force she didn't understand, she knelt and lifted it. It was surprisingly light. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid. The interior was lined with faded blue velvet. Nestled inside were two items. The first was a piece of folded yellowed parchment. Carefully she unfolded it. It was a drawing, a child's sketch done in charcoal. It depicted a little girl with a cascade of wild curly hair and a wide smile holding a flower. Despite the clumsy rendering, the subject was unmistakable. It was her. The artist had perfectly captured the unique golden red shade of her hair and the shape of her eyes. Aurelia's breath caught in her throat. Beneath the drawing lay the second item, a single perfectly preserved flower. Its petals were a deep, sunny yellow, its shape unmistakable. It was a sun petal, a flower that grew only in the royal seaside gardens of her home Eldoria. And then the memory hit her rushing back with the force of a tidal wave. She had been 8 years old, attending a tedious diplomatic summit with her father in a neutral city. Bored with the endless talks, she had slipped away into the gardens. There she had found a boy sitting alone on a stone bench. He was a few years older, with dark hair and startlingly pale grey eyes, filled with a profound sadness she hadn't understood. He wore the dark, severe clothes of the Cinderfall delegation. He looked lonely. Impulsively she had walked up to him and offered him the bright yellow sun petal she had just picked. "To make you smile," she had said. "My mother says they hold the sunshine." The boy had looked at her, his silent astonishment, a tangible thing. He hadn't spoken, but he had taken the flower, his cool fingers brushing hers. He had just stared at her, this strange, bright girl who had offered him a piece of her sunshine. She had smiled at him one last time before her governess found her and whisked her away. She had never known his name. She had forgotten the encounter completely. Until now. That quiet, lonely boy with the sad grey eyes had been Valerius. Aurelia sank to the floor, her legs suddenly weak. She stared at the contents of the box, the crude drawing of her, the flower she had given him. He had kept it. For more than a decade, through wars and political turmoil, through his ascension to power and the forging of his iron reputation, he had kept this small, forgotten token of a brief, sunlit moment. He hadn't just married a stranger to secure a treaty. He had married the girl from the garden, the girl who had shown him a flicker of kindness when no one else had. Everything clicked into place with a painful, stunning clarity. His unreadable stares were not empty. They were full of a history she never knew they shared. His coldness, his distance, was it anger that she didn't remember him? Or was it a shield, a desperate attempt to protect that small, vulnerable part of himself, the lonely boy who had treasured a single flower? The rules, the isolation. Perhaps they truly were a twisted, misguided attempt to keep her safe in his treacherous court, to keep the memory of that sun-drenched girl untainted by the shadows he lived in. He hadn't secretly adored her since childhood, in a simple romantic way. He had clung to the memory of her as a symbol of a warmth and light he had never known. And now she was here in his grasp, and he had no idea how to deal with her, this living embodiment of his only good memory. She carefully placed the drawing and the flower back in the box and closed the lid. She returned it to its hiding place, her movements slow and deliberate. She left the dusty rooms, locking the door behind her, the old iron key feeling warm in her hand. The plot to kill him was no longer just a threat to a political alliance. It was a threat to the boy who had kept a flower for 15 years. Her fear was gone, replaced by a fierce protective fire. They had called her an irrelevance. They had no idea who she was. More importantly, they had no idea who her husband truly was, and she would not let their darkness extinguish the last flicker of light he held inside him. Armed with her newfound knowledge, Aurelia's plan solidified. She couldn't wait for a chance encounter in the garden. She had to force his hand. The next morning, she deliberately dismissed Lena for an hour, and then, in a calculated act of defiance, walked out of her wing unescorted. It took less than 5 minutes for the guards to intercept her. As she had anticipated, they did not dare lay a hand on her, but they formed a respectful, unbreachable wall in the corridor, insisting she return. "I will not," she said, her voice clear and firm. "I will speak with the prince. Now." Her defiance caused a minor uproar. Word was sent. Within a quarter of an hour, Garrick arrived, his scarred face set in a grim line. "Princess, you are to return to your rooms. The prince is occupied. He can be unoccupied," she countered, standing her ground. "It is a matter of state security." The use of those specific words, delivered with an authority no one had ever heard from her, gave Garrick pause. He studied her for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. "Wait here." He returned with Valerius. The prince's face was like a thundercloud, his grey eyes flashing with cold fury. He strode toward her, his presence so intense the guards instinctively took a step back. "You will explain the meaning of this spectacle," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Aurelia's heart hammered, but she did not flinch. She met his anger with a steady gaze. "Not here. Somewhere private. Somewhere we cannot be overheard." He stared at her, a silent battle of wills waging between them. The Iron Prince was being challenged by his silent, obedient wife, and the entire corridor was watching. Finally, with a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, he gestured sharply down the hall. "My Sola." He led the way, his long strides, forcing her to almost run to keep up. He did not speak until the heavy oak door of his private study was closed and barred behind them. The room was like him, functional Spartan, dominated by a massive desk covered in maps and military dispatches. "You have my attention, Princess," he said, turning on her. "This had better be worth disrupting my entire household. Lord Corbin is planning to kill you," she said, the words rushing out. "He means to stage an accident. I am to be a convenient casualty to be blamed on a failed Eldorian plot." The anger in his eyes was instantly replaced by an absolute chilling stillness. He did not look surprised. He looked confirmed. "How do you know this? I overheard him speaking with another man in the corridor outside my chambers a few nights ago. They spoke of the attempt with the wine at the banquet. They are growing impatient." He crossed the room to a large map of the kingdom, pinned to the wall, his back to her. He was silent for a long time, his posture rigid. "You should have come to me immediately." How she shot back her own frustration, boiling over. "I am your prisoner, watched day and night. Any deviation from my routine would have been reported. For all I knew, it would be reported to Corbin himself. You told me to trust no one. I was obeying your command." He turned around slowly, his expression unreadable. "You placed yourself in great danger by waiting. I am in great danger simply by being your wife." The raw truth of her words hung in the air between them. A muscle worked in his jaw. He walked to his desk and poured 2 goblets of water from a pitcher. He handed one to her. His fingers brushed hers, and the brief contact was like a spark of lightning. "You are correct," he said, his voice softer, now stripped of its anger. "I have failed to ensure your safety." He took a long drink of water, his eyes never leaving hers. "The situation is more advanced than I realized. Corbin has more support in the Citadel than I can root out quickly. We are not safe here." Just then, a frantic pounding came at the door. "Your Highness." An urgent matter. It was Garrick's voice. Valerius strode to the door and opened it. The captain was breathless, his expression dire. "My lord, there's been a fire in the west stables. A diversion. My sources say Corbin's men are moving. They plan to storm the royal wing within the hour under the guise of restoring order from the chaos." The trap was closing. Valerius's decision was instantaneous. He was once again the commander, his mind sharp and clear in the face of crisis. "Garrick, gather 5 of your most loyal men. Meet us at the northern postern gate. Bring trail rations, water, and cloaks. No royal colours. We ride for the old mountain fortress at Greywatch." And the Princess Garrick asked his gaze, flicking to Aurelia. "She comes with me," Valerius said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned to Aurelia. "There is no time to pack. We leave now." The next few minutes were a blur. Valerius pulled a heavy fur-lined traveller's cloak from a wardrobe and threw it around her shoulders. He strapped on his sword belt and grabbed a long dagger which he tucked into his boot. He led her through a series of hidden passages behind a tapestry, his hand firmly on her arm, pulling her along through the dark, narrow stone corridors. The citadel she had known was merely a facade. Beneath it lay a secret network of escape routes. They emerged into a small, dark stable near the outer wall, where a grim-faced Garrick waited with 2 horses already saddled. They were lean, hardy mountain breeds, not the elegant steeds of the royal stable. Within moments they were mounted Garrick and his handful of loyal guards, closing in around them. The postern gate creaked open, and they slipped out into the pre-dawn gloom, leaving the citadel, the fire and Corbin's plot behind them. They rode hard, Valerius leading the way, pushing their horses to a punishing pace. Aurelia was a skilled rider, but she had to struggle to keep up. The cold air burned her lungs, and the rough gait of the mountain horse jarred her bones. They rode north into the unforgiving wilderness of Cinderfall's mountains. The jagged peaks loomed over them like silent stone giants. This was Valerius's land in its truest form, wild, beautiful, and dangerous. As they rode, he fell back to ride beside her. "Can you continue?" he asked, his voice rough against the wind. "Yes," she replied, her teeth chattering from a combination of cold and adrenaline. He reached over, adjusting the hood of her cloak to better shield her face from the biting wind. It was a small, practical gesture, but in that moment, it felt like more. It was an act of care. For 2 days they traveled through dense forests and treacherous mountain passes. They ate dried meat and hard bread and slept for a few precious hours, huddled by a campfire with the guards taking turns on watch. The layers of royalty were stripped away by the harshness of their flight. He was no longer the Iron Prince, and she was no longer the pampered princess. They were just 2 people fighting for survival. She saw a new side of him. He was at home in the wilderness, reading the landscape like a book, navigating by the stars. He ensured she had the warmer spot by the fire and the larger share of the rations. During one perilous river crossing when her horse stumbled, he was in the freezing water in an instant, his strong arm around her waist, guiding them both to the safety of the far bank. On the evening of the 2nd day, they stopped in a sheltered ravine. As Garrick set the watch, Valerius tended to the horses. Aurelia sat by the small crackling fire, trying to warm her numb fingers. He came and sat across from her, the firelight playing over his tired, dirt-streaked face. The silence was comfortable, a shared respite from the danger that pursued them. "You were right to be angry," he said suddenly, his voice low. "I did make you a prisoner. I thought it was the only way to keep you safe, to keep you separate from the corruption in my court. I see now it only made you a more vulnerable target." It was the closest he had ever come to an apology. Why she asked the question she had been holding in her heart since she found the wooden box. Why go to such lengths? I was a political bride, a stranger. He looked into the flames, his grey eyes reflecting the dancing light. "You were never a stranger to me, Aurelia." He said her name for the first time, and it sounded like a secret finally being told. "I have known who you were for 15 years. The confession lay between them as raw and real as the wilderness around them. The flight from the citadel had been a journey not just across miles of harsh terrain, but across the vast frozen distance he had placed between them. Here in the heart of his mountains, the walls were finally beginning to crumble. They reached the fortress of Greywatch late on the third day. It was an ancient, formidable structure built directly into the stony face of a mountain, accessible only by a single, narrow, winding path. It was a place of last resort, a bastion that had never fallen. Inside a skeleton crew of veteran soldiers, men of unquestionable loyalty to Valerius greeted them with grim efficiency. The fortress was Spartan but secure. Aurelia was given a chamber with a hearth where a fire was quickly laid. The warmth was a luxury after days in the cold. A servant brought a simple meal of stew and bread, and for the first time since their flight began a sense of safety, however temporary, settled over her. Later that evening, there was a soft knock on her door. It was Valerius. He had shed his travel-stained leathers for a simple woolen tunic and breeches. His dark hair was damp, and the exhaustion of their journey was etched on his features, yet his pale eyes were clear and focused on her. "May I enter?" he asked. It was the first time he had ever asked for her permission. She nodded, stepping back to let him in. He walked to the hearth, staring down into the crackling flames. The room was filled with a tense silence, thick with all the things that had been left unsaid between them. Aurelia's courage, bolstered by the revelations of the past few days, didn't fail her. "You said you have known who I was for 15 years. She began, her voice steady. "You remembered me. From the garden." He turned from the fire to face her. In the soft light, the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften. "Remember you," he said, a wry, melancholic twist to his lips. "Aurelia, in the years that followed, the memory of you was the only warmth I knew." He took a step closer, his gaze intense, compelling. "You must understand what my childhood was like. My father was a hard man. He ruled a hard kingdom. My older brother was the heir, charming, skilled, everything my father wanted. I was the spare, quiet, overlooked, sent to study war while my brother learned to rule. The court was a place of shifting allegiances and quiet threats. There was no kindness, no light, until that day." He paused as if the memory was still overwhelmingly vivid. "And then there was you. This bright little creature unafraid of my cinderfall clothes or my silence. You gave me a flower. You told me it held the sunshine." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but it held no humor. No one had ever given me anything without wanting something in return. It was a gesture of pure, unprompted kindness. I never forgot it. I kept the flower. I tried to draw your face from memory so I wouldn't forget that either. The confession washed over her, a wave of profound understanding. The lonely boy, the Iron Prince, They were one and the same, two sides of a coin, minted in pain. When the treaty was proposed, he continued, his voice dropping lower, and my father's counsellors presented your portrait. I accepted without hesitation. They thought it was a shrewd political move. They had no idea I was finally claiming the only good thing I had ever known. Then why, she whispered the question aching in her heart. Why treat me with such coldness? Why lock me away? Did you hate me for not remembering you hate you? He looked genuinely shocked. No, never. I was protecting you, and I was protecting that memory. I arrived home from the wars to a kingdom rife with corruption. My father was dead, my brother killed in a hunting accident. I now know was arranged by men like Corbin. I had to be ruthless. I had to become the Iron Prince they whispered about, to wrest control, to forge stability from chaos. There was no room for softness. He moved closer still, closing the distance between them until he was only an arm's length away. And then you arrived. You were just as I remembered, that same light in your eyes. I brought you into this den of vipers, and I was terrified. Terrified they would use you against me. Terrified their darkness would touch you, would tarnish the one pure thing in my life. So I built a wall around you. I thought if I kept you isolated, treated you as nothing more than a political figurehead, my enemies would see you as unimportant, powerless. They would leave you alone. Like Lord Corbin said, she murmured. An irrelevance. It was a foolish, clumsy plan, he admitted, his voice laced with self-recrimination. I am a soldier, not a courtier. I know how to command an army, how to break a siege. I do not know. I did not know how to care for a treasure. My methods were cold and cruel. I hurt you when all I ever wanted was to keep you safe. This was the heart of it, the ultimate paradox of the Iron Prince. His cruelty was a shield, his coldness a clumsy, misguided act of love. He was so afraid of losing the sunshine that he had locked it in a dark room. Aurelia felt the last of her fear melt away, replaced by a surge of empathy, so powerful it stole her breath. She saw him now completely. The lonely boy, the brutal commander, the tormented king-in-waiting, and the man who had loved her from afar for half his life. She closed the final step between them, and to her own surprise, she reached up and gently touched his face. His skin was cool, but he flinched as if from a brand, his eyes closing for a brief moment. He was so unused to gentle touch. "You are not just a soldier, Valerius," she said softly, using his name again, claiming it. "I have seen you. You heal the broken things. You protect the vulnerable. That is who you are." He opened his eyes, and the cool grey was now turbulent like a stormy sea. He slowly raised his hand and covered hers where it rested on his cheek. His hand was large and calloused from years of wielding a sword, but his touch was incredibly gentle. Aurelia, he breathed her name, a prayer and a plea, all in one. In the quiet, firelit room, high in the mountain fortress, the Iron Prince and the Sunstone Princess finally found each other. All the pain, the loneliness, the misunderstanding, it all fell away. He was not her jailer, and she was not his prisoner. They were allies, partners. He lowered his head, and she tilted hers up, and in the heart of the unforgiving Cinderfall winter, their lips met for the first time. It was not a kiss of practiced passion, but one of raw, hesitant discovery, a promise of a spring that had been 15 years in the waiting. Their return was a calculated deception, using Lord Corbin's greatest weakness against him, his dismissal of Aurelia as an irrelevant pawn. She was discovered near the woods, a seemingly broken victim, telling a tale of Eldorian betrayal and her husband's death. Corbin took the bait completely. He summoned the court parading the weeping princess as proof of the foreign threat. Standing before the obsidian throne, he delivered a triumphant speech, ready to accept the regency he believed was finally his. And so I must assume stewardship. Corbin began, but was cut short by a voice from the shadows. The vipers are not at the gate, Corbin. They are in this room. Valerius emerged in full armor as Aurelia's fearful act vanished, replaced by cold fury. "You called me a pet," she declared, her voice ringing with authority. But pets have ears. She exposed his entire plot just as loyal soldiers appeared, and sealed the hall, trapping the traitors. Enraged and cornered, Corbin lunged not at the prince, but at Aurelia. He never reached her. Valerius's sword moved in a silver blur, and the traitor fell dead upon the stone floor. A stark silence fell. Valerius ignored the throne, turning instead to take Aurelia's hand and raising it for all to see. "Cinderfall is united," he announced to the stunned court. "Her counsel is my counsel. We rule together." Later that night, in their shared chambers, Valerius held her the Iron Prince facade gone forever. "I am simply Valerius," he murmured, "the man who has loved you since you gave him a flower full of sunshine." She turned in his arms finally home. The cage was gone, the shadows vanquished. In the heart of the cold kingdom, a love hidden for 15 years was finally free to bloom. And so, the Iron Prince and the Sunstone Princess began their true reign, their love story, not a fairy tale whispered in hushed tones, but a saga forged in fire and shadow, proving that the strongest kingdoms are built not on fear, but on a love that was brave enough to wait. Their legend became a beacon of hope, a testament to the truth that can bloom in the harshest of lands. What did you think of Aurelia's courage and Valerius's hidden devotion? Let me know in the comments below. If you were captivated by their journey, please don't forget to like this video, share it with a fellow romance lover, and subscribe for more tales of love against all odds.